So thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Okay. Are you ready, Emily?
Mm-hmm.
3, 2, 1. Welcome to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP FM, your local community radio station here in Brattleboro. I also want to welcome all our YouTube viewers to this video as well. My name is Olga Peters. I'm the host of the Montpelier Happy Hour, and I want to welcome regular contributor, Representative Emilie Kornheiser. Hey, Emily.
Good morning, Olga.
And we are very happy to have on the show today Kelley Tully, who is the first, this is your first show, basically, since you were nominated to fill Matt Treber's seat for the Windham 3 House seat. We are so glad to have you today, Kelley. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Let's start with just a quick get to know you for the community who hasn't met you yet.
Okay.
And Emily, you ask your question so beautifully, rather than the journalist question of give us your bio.
Before I ask my question, I'm going to say, Olga, I think the habit that we have of calling it Matt Treber's seat or whomever else's seat is a disservice to democracy, because it's the community seat and not whoever's sitting in it. And that's something we're very careful about on the floor. It's part of the ritual of the floor, is that we say the representative from Rockingham or the representative from Brattleboro. And it's really an acknowledgement that we're just there as sort of the voice of our community.
Thank you, Emily. That's a good reminder. What I'm thinking about as a journalist right now is how do I give listeners quick context? Since most listeners are like, Windham 3, what?
I know, where is that?
Or who's my house rep? Or Rockingham? Wait, no, I live in Bellows Falls. So thank you. I will think about that. But
I think both are important. It's just also like,
Yeah.
you know, Kelley is nothing like Matt, I assume. And so that's also really interesting.
which is
sort of
exciting.
Like, it is. Change is fun. So anyway, Kelley, hi.
Yeah. Hi.
I'm so curious, what brought you to this particular moment in your life? Like, what's happened that informed what's happening now? And like, how and why are you here?
Well, it's kind of a I don't know, a long time coming. Certainly my family has been in Vermont since the late 1600s. So we're kind of entrenched in our community. And we've done lots of different things. And so born and raised in this area, always really important to take care of each other and take care of each other in your own communities, which again, Vermont is a small community when you think about it, but more local. So that's part of it. I certainly have done a lot of different things over the years. One of my favorite and best things is being a nurse, which is actually who I am, not just what I do. So I'm pretty thrilled. And my mom was a nurse, so it's kind of a family tradition. So I'm pretty pleased because she's a pretty amazing, strong woman. And about, I want to say 4.5 years ago, my husband passed away. And he was a super charismatic guy who was in politics in his own right, but it was never anything official. But he kind of was an inspiration to get to know everybody and to reach out. And we always, he would always have a good sense. He actually was a friend of Mike Obuchowski's. So who was a longtime representative from our area as well. So it's kind of a little bit of everything. And I have a new chapter in my life after certainly his inspirational years that we were together. And now I have a little bit more time to dedicate to I think the people in the community and at greater Vermont as well. So kind of a different phase in my life. But I've always volunteered. I've always helped in the local school system, so much that some of the kids thought I worked there, which was, I think, very flattering. And to support the teachers and the good work that they do. And I've coached for a number of years and done whatever I could just to help in our local community.
And Kelley, I'm curious, did you put your name forward for the seat, or were you asked to put your name forward?
Well, a little bit of both. A little
Mhm.
bit of both. I had been recently working with the town of Rockingham on a transportation committee, and as the secretary of the BFADC, the Bellows Falls Area Development Corp. So I had, I'd been working with those folks on different projects, and I just talking about it and tossing the idea around in a group, and so that's how it came to be, just with the local people as well as in some of the committee work.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yes.
So I was on a panel last night of racial and ethnic minorities that have run for office. And one of the things that came up is something that often comes up when I've attended women running for office events, which is this whole idea that a woman, that gets floated around, that a woman needs to be asked 5 times before she runs for office. And that a man just sort of like wakes up in the morning and decides that they deserve an office seat. And I don't, and I say that because I don't think that's actually true. It's just sort of a trope that circulates through, with some truth to it, but it sort of circulates through the political arena.
Uh-huh.
And I think it's really interesting because I didn't need to be asked 5 times. No one asked me to run for office. I just decided it's what I wanted to do. And I think it's interesting that we, so I'm curious about what you said about it's just sort of like it's something that evolved or came up rather than needing an explicit ask, because I appreciate that like this is sort of, often a naturally evolving thing where we sort of find permission for ourselves, but someone doesn't need to give us permission. So I'm curious if you could flesh it out a little bit more.
I actually, when I heard that he was stepping down, I actually asked somebody whose opinion that I value. I said, what do you think about me going for this? Because I think that I bring something different to the government. And it was really, again, it was my idea. And I thought that, I guess I just was looking for validation that they thought I had, because I want to do a good job and I don't want to misrepresent the people in the area. So I was looking, I did, it was not a long conversation. Certainly it wasn't 5 people is what I'm trying to say, is that it was just, I said, well, what do you think? I think I could offer something. And they gave me the validation. And so I put my hat in the ring.
What's the different thing that you think you offer?
Well, I think one that I've, again, worn many, on the hat theme, worn many hats, and I've done different aspects. And I've, again, back to locally caring for the people in your community, literally and figuratively, that certainly you see the needs of the folks and you think you might be able to have an impact on their voice. That's kind of what drove me.
So Kelley and Emilie, I'd like to step back for a moment just for the sake of listeners and talk about how this seat came open. It was held by Matt Trieber, and I think it was January, Emilie, that he announced his resignation, and that started the nomination process. So can we just give a quick outline to listeners who may not be familiar with how a seat is filled if the person leaves it partway through a term? So the first step is, of course, the resignation, and then is it the county chairs of the party of the outgoing
This is one
representative.
This is one of the things that's really fascinating to me about this particular seat from like the dynamic of the county committee's perspective. So the governor appoints from a list that is sent from the party.
Right.
And for a county-wide seat, the Windham County, if it was a Democrat seat, the Windham County Democratic Committee would appoint for a county-wide seat. And for a town-wide seat, so if someone from Brattleboro resigned, the Brattleboro Democratic Committee would send up names.
And we're saying Democrat because Trieber was a Democrat.
Trieber was a Democrat.
If it had been a Republican, it would have been
absolutely.
the Republican.
And for an independent, it's like slightly more confusing, and I don't we don't need to explain that because that's not what we're talking about. And so, but for this particular seat, of which, you know, the most of the seats in the county are like this, it's made up of multiple towns that have multiple committees. And so what's interesting to me about it is all of those town committees had never actually had a meeting together before. And so it was like a whole new dynamic when all those committees got put together to do that.
Hey, Kelley, you're already shaking things up.
And so John Hagan, the county committee chair, certainly helped facilitate like that configuring and understanding of the rules and all of that. But it was the town committees that did the work. And I wasn't there. So Kelley, please take it from here about what actually happened there.
Well, I actually, I consulted with Carolyn Partridge, who's a great resource. And she
She's the other rep for the seat? For that same, it's a 2-seat district? Okay.
That's correct. And so she was super helpful on the process and how it goes. And she just, from a procedure point, because she actually had gone through something similar when she first got into the state legislature. That was part of, so she knew what to expect. And she just explained that the committee has to get together. So they have people from the whole district. So that's Windham, Athens, Grafton, Rockingham, and part of North Westminster. So they all, the group got together and then nominated the folks that were interested in the seat, and then we had a question and answer. So and then they vote, and the way so there was two of us, Leslie Goldman and myself, but Carolyn had explained in the past, again because I'd never done the process before, that so say there were 5 people interested in the role. She explained that it would be the top 3 vote getters. It could, you know, however many number that is, would then get the name sent to the governor, and then they would get interviewed, and the way it was explained to me is that a governor could select one of the 3, somebody completely different, or nobody at all. So that's how the process was explained to me, and so it ended up being just 2 of us, and the group asked, you know, a lot of questions, and so it was very helpful getting to talk to everybody.
What was the hardest question that you were asked during that question and answer period?
I think one of the hardest ones was about certainly higher education, and the cost of it in our state. That was probably the one that is, you know, I think pretty meaningful across the board, no matter where you're at. And it was kind of tagged in with keeping young people in our state, only because of the population declining and the age of our population increasing. And so that probably to me was the hardest one.
Mm-hmm. And what was the most fun? Like, what was the best part of this process?
Well, I think that a lot of people are not really aware of how close you are to our political system. Mm-hmm. And that, you know, that certainly struck a chord with me, even though, you know, people can have opinions and they can think they know the process, or think they know because they might have studied civics in school. And then when you realize, you're like, well, we can touch our legislatures, you know, because they live in our town, or, you know, that to me, that was pretty eye-opening. And, you know, when you actually start getting involved, and I'm sure Emilie probably feels something very similar, that you're local, you hear their voices, you see their successes and their struggles, and then you can take that information to the State House. It always seems unattainable, but it really isn't.
What do you hope, or let me phrase this a little differently. What do you think Montpelier, or the legislative body as a whole, what do you wish they knew about your community that perhaps they don't?
I love that question.
That's a great question. I think that our community certainly has had, it's been an industrial town for, a couple hundred years, and it has its ups and downs, and it has it's beautiful setting. We're right on the Connecticut River. We've got a lot of public lands that people have access to. I think that there's a lot of, there's struggles on people in affordable housing. I mean, those are always topics that come up, but we have identified ourselves for years as an old mill town, because when I was a kid, we still had mills in town, but now we do not. And I think we have to help ourselves to shed some of that old stuff and kind of get on with some new stuff, hopefully new jobs, however big or small they are, just to keep everybody working.
Mm-hmm.
So Brattleboro has higher numbers certainly than Bellows Falls and the surrounding area. And Bellows Falls is the name everybody says is the town of Rockingham, and it has 3 villages in the town of Rockingham. So it is. I think some people are like, oh, Rockingham, is that anywhere near Bellows Falls? As a matter of fact, it is.
Yes, right next to each other.
Right.
Emily, what would you like to ask Kelley?
What are you most looking forward to about this process? I mean, I imagine it's very hard. This is just I can't get over what a strange time this would be to become a legislator. And I know that you haven't known anything different, and I appreciate that. But yeah, what are you looking forward to the most about this process? That's my question. It's an easy one.
I'm really looking forward to this is a great first step really to kind of engage with you guys, and to also, I know that you had done the training with Mitzi and how voting and online, and it was really nice just to meet everybody. So that's a piece that certainly is missing in-person meets. However, I did meet Bill McGill with the clerk. We both had our masks and we're 6 feet away as we did the swearing in, which was super interesting.
Oh, we should use that picture as the picture for the show.
Oh yes, can you send us that picture?
Yeah, I can try to get my IT person over here. My cousin could probably help me with that. But yeah, so that was I look forward to actually. So every time I email somebody, I try to keep track of who I've met, and the actual book that they give you on who the representatives and senators are, I kind of jot down that we've connected through email in case I forget, because it's not, in person. But I really want to hear what everybody has to say, because I think everybody brings something different to the table, and that we can only learn if we keep our minds open and listen to other people's thoughts, and hopefully it's not going to be exactly what we think, but maybe somewhere in the middle, give or take, is gonna teach us something, and that we can make the best decisions for Vermonters. Mm-hmm. That's what I look forward to, hearing what people have to say and embracing their experience, and also just the process. And again, everybody says it's a really weird time to enter into the House right now, and I agree. But as I talked to Emily last night, I said, well, I don't know any different, so I'm not mourning a loss of something that I never had. So hopefully I'm excited that if we ever get back in person, that I can learn that part as well.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, you have a background as a nurse, mm-hmm. and then you've also worked in the business side of your community as well.
Right.
And I'm wondering, as you're looking at how COVID is impacting our communities right now, I'm wondering what you are seeing as far as the cracks it's kind of showing where our communities were weak and need support. um, because, you know, going forward, the hope is that we can come out of this more resilient.
Right.
And so, yeah, what cracks are you seeing, and do you have any thoughts you could share on how to kind of shore up places in our community that need that help?
Well, I think that we're for the most part, I think Vermont is still a super rural state. So we're fortunate to be able to get out, even though we're staying safe, but we can walk around the block or we can walk out in our backyard because a lot of people have access to that. The part that I guess still confuses me is the communication. When I say communication, I mean person to person, not necessarily, because the Vermont Department of Health is really updating their website, and I get updates daily, and I look at that at least a couple times a day to see what's changed. And they've sent out I don't know if you've had a chance to look at, they have a cute little video about staying safe at home. It's only about a minute long, and it's very nice and uplifting. And there are a lot of really good things going on with that. But the people in the public that I see that aren't wearing masks, that are not social distancing, that to me is the biggest thing. And I certainly remind everybody as I walk by them with a mask and say, don't forget about social distancing. And some people, it's just amazing to me how there's people that you could have the extreme, people who are, you know, they wear a mask in their car by themselves, which they don't really need to do, but they're taking it that seriously. And then you have the other people that hug and greet each other on the street with no mask and no distancing. So that part, to get us all able to level this out and on the downswing, we all have to practice the same thing. So I think it's just communicating with each other expectations. And it's kind of like coaching that, well, I've said cover your nose. They should know it by now, but they don't. So you always have to remind people to cover their face when they cough or sneeze, even before this happened. So we're just changing the words a little bit. Wash your hands, 20 seconds. Count it out, sing it out. You just have to keep coaching each other so we can help really all of ourselves. That's what I see on a daily basis, the constant coaching. I think the majority of the people are taking it seriously, but you have the few that if it doesn't affect them, I'm not sure. I really don't have an answer for why they're not taking it seriously, but I don't mind reminding them and coaching them up.
I love that answer. Sign of the time. So it's my birthday this week, and I met friends for a social distance walk around the BUHS track, and they were so sweet. They brought me birthday gifts, and one of them brought me a handmade mask.
Awesome.
So yeah, sign of the times. You're getting face masks for birthday presents.
Got mine in the mail yesterday from my select board member and friend, Liz McLaughlin.
Look at that.
3 of us for our family.
That is snazzy.
She has an incredible fabric collection, and I love all of ours. And this one is, I'm pretty psyched on my mask.
Yeah. 3 cheers for Elizabeth. That's a very nice looking mask.
Thanks.
I've had my my cousin and friend here, and we most nights make. I was telling Emily last night, we try to make 10 masks a night. I think we've made and it's a little bit different style, but I always tell people, just make sure you can wash it in the washing machine and dry it. And we've made we're not quite 100 masks, but we're closing in on it. So we have a little system. Everybody does it. I'm the sewer, and they do all the folding and the measuring and the ironing. So keep giving those out.
I know Carolyn Partridge is also spending an enormous amount of time sewing masks. So I love that both of you, sharing that seat, are deep in mask sewing. Whenever we have a call together, she's always sewing masks the whole time. I'm like, Carolyn, your machine's a little loud.
I did that with my mother. My mother's a master sewer, and she and I were sewing together last week. It was actually very fun. Our social distancing sewing bee there.
Nice. I think the issue around people who aren't able to social distance right now, or are choosing not to social distance, I think is a really interesting one. And when I think about the folks I know who are still in some ways living their lives the way they always have, they're mostly folks who have had to make so many other adjustments in their lives because of economic stress or chronic trauma, or they've had so little ability to make decisions in their lives because of sort of what economic and social circumstances they found themselves in, that they just seem to not be able to make one more adjustment. It's just like, it's just not even available. That like extra information is not available to them. And it's really interesting to me in that we're asking we're asking our whole community, our whole state, our whole nation to make basically the same adjustment. But my social distancing experience is like fairly glorious in my spacious house with all the birds all around me. And other people's social distance experience might be in a, tiny uncomfortable apartment or a tiny uncomfortable room. And I have a lot of resiliency around like making new decisions and being flexible. And some folks really don't. Right. And so it's interesting to me that we sort of have this level set expectation of everyone, but the individual experience of living that is very, very different for each person. And it's one of the things that I find sort of fascinating about this time is that we have the same expectation of everyone, but people's ability to carry that out and people's experience of that is so, so different. And that's just something I've been sort of sitting with, what the lessons are into the future as we observe that.
I think what you say, Emily, is so crucial because we're seeing that big now, as we all have the same expectation, but because this pandemic will not have impacted people equally or equitably or in the same way, it will also really, I feel, impact the recovery process, because we won't be able to have a one-size-fits-all recovery process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Kelley, I know you can only be with us for about half an hour this morning, so we're just about out of time. But I want to make sure, is there anything you want the community to know about you? If they have questions for you, do you have a way for them to contact you at this point? I know everything's still very new, but yeah, I'd love to give you a minute or two to share anything with the community you'd like them to know.
Well, sure. I'm pretty accessible. I mean, again, if the people locally here in town certainly know how to find me, and I'm not hard to find. I do have I had aspirations. I did not finish it last night to finish a Facebook page, because I think also there's a lot of good information that I'd love to post for people to be able to see in our area about what the services and what things are happening. And I know there's a lot of frustration around unemployment access. And I think that's really a big deal for everybody. So I do hopefully by the end of today to have that finished and get it up so I can start reaching out, and then people can message me, certainly email and all that.
Do you have a legislative email address yet?
I do. It's ktully at
ledge.state.
Yes.
That'll roll off your tongue soon, I promise.
There you go. Thank you. Absolutely, that works at email. I guess it felt real when I had the email set up. So.
And Kelley, just so you know, Olga always asks that question at the end of every interview. Is there anything else you would like to tell me? And so I'm never prepared for it, so I'm warning you.
Thank you. And is there anything you folks think I should think about or get to as I go forward?
I really hope that you're able to communicate your experiences as a nurse and as someone who's been involved in business. I think and I hope it can inform policy, because I think in our community, we put a lot of things in buckets, and we tend to separate business over here and nonprofits over here and that type of thing. And I think you have a great opportunity, because you've been in all these different camps and worn these different hats, to perhaps integrate some of these silos or these buckets. So I hope that you can find a way to do that, because I think it would be very valuable.
Thank you. That's good advice.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Emilie?
Take your time.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of an incredible gift to be entering right now with all of this, at least physical space around us.
Right.
And so, yeah, take your time. There's so much to learn and there's so many people to meet and there are so many questions to answer, but you'll never get to all of it. There's always going to be more work to do. And so like start off by giving yourself a little spaciousness around that.
Thank you. I
You're
appreciate
welcome.
that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, Kelley Tully, the new representative for the Windham 3 district to the House of Representatives, thank you for serving and welcome to this game that we call Montpelier and policymaking and government.
Thank you very much.
So that is all the time we have for Kelley. If you have more time and you wanted to stay, you are more than welcome. But we are going to take a quick break and the Montpelier Happy Hour will return in a moment. Welcome back to the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 FM LP, your Brattleboro community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters. If you're just joining us, we had just on the show Kelley Tully. She's the new representative for Windham 3. And now we are back. Emilie Kornheiser and I. Hey, Emilie.
Hey, Olga. I don't know if our listeners have noticed that we used to have matching little pink earbuds, and now we have matching big black headphones. And in both cases, it was just a coincidence.
I know, we're very good at, and have you ever noticed how often our outfits match too?
And we're not texting each other before we get dressed like middle school girls. We are just doing this naturally.
So it's good. It's good. Is that syncopation?
Yeah.
Synchronicity? There we go.
All those things.
All those things.
All those things.
All those shining balls of light. So Emilie, I want to kind of keep in the vein of representation, since we just spoke with Kelley from Windham 3, and talk about a new task force that the governor has launched. And it's basically a COVID recovery task force. And it has different groups. For those who don't know, some people are looking at small businesses, some people are looking at community action, but they're all about kind of the recovery process from COVID. And there's 19 people on this task force, if I have the number correctly. And some folks south of Route 4, which is all of Bennington County, Windham County, and a good portion of Rutland and Windsor County, have taken issue with this task force. Because of all the members, there's one person from south of Route 4 to represent the southern part of the state. And for me, I want to talk to you about this, Emilie, because I'm curious. You know, I have grown up with that trope of, well, as far as Montpelier is concerned, anything south of Route 4 is Massachusetts, and they don't need to worry about it. And, you know, the whole thing like, oh, well, I actually live in Vermont, Massachusetts, or the Forgotten Kingdom or something like that. And people are feeling that having only one person on this task force is symbolic of that. From you, as someone who is serving in Montpelier, and you're from south of Route 4, is this a real thing? Are there needs of the southern Vermont that are not being met in general? And do we need to be concerned about the representation on this task force?
So that's a lot of different questions, Olga. So I hope you can hold the question for me a little bit while I answer parts of it, and then because I want to get to all of them.
Because it's a big mushy situation.
So I think even how we describe southern Vermont, I think is really, really different from different people's perspectives. So I've often seen meetings in Randolph as described as like southern Vermont meetings, right? And that is north of Route 4, yes?
Yeah,
like
I think Randolph, isn't it technically the geographic center?
Yes, it is. It is technically the geographic center and hard for everyone to get to. And so,
which is symbolic of itself.
You know, there's some people who think like parts of Rutland County don't count as southern Vermont, and there's some people who think all of Rutland County is southern Vermont, and there's, you know, like Northern Windsor? How does it all, so everyone is already arguing about like what Southern Vermont is. And I'm sure like Guilford and Vernon and Pownell feel like particularly forgotten, right? Because we even forget about them in like, very Southern Brattleboro sometimes. No, we don't. We never forget about Guilford and Vernon. Sometimes we forget about Pownell. So there's that, which is already, and it's sort of similar to, growing up New York, like to Manhattan, Northern New York is like anything north of the Bronx, whereas to people who actually like live in Northern New York, that's like the Canadian border. And so we have that geographic relativity issue, the same way we have a relativity issue for anything, right? When I think about sort of issues affecting Southern Vermont that might be forgotten, there are some, but there's also issues that affect the Connecticut River corridor, right? That often get lost when we talk about the Lake Champlain Basin. There are issues that affect people who live in border towns that are totally forgotten when we think about people who live closer to the middle of the state. There are people, who experience, people in rural areas that get forgotten in the context of urban needs. Brattleboro often sort of falls like deeply in the middle between all of those issues. And then there's people who don't really have highways versus people who do. So like all of Bennington County is just impossible to get to, right? And big parts of the kingdom are sort of impossible to get to because of this just like lack of road problem. And so yes, like representation matters. I mean, that's why we like, the House and the Senate are configured differently. Like that's sort of the assumption of all of this, is that representation matters. But I'm not entirely sure that Southern Vermont is sort of a behemoth that has similar needs. Certainly the particular place that the tourism and second home economy has on our communities is very significant. But the community with the largest percentage of second homes in the state, I think, is in the kingdom. And so there's that piece. There's that we don't really have a large corporation housed here. But that's, again, like that's really just more of a Chittenden and everyone else kind of phenomenon, not a Southern Vermont versus other places phenomenon. Certainly Bennington and Windham County politics are significantly different, even though they both have Democratic majorities. Issues tend to play out differently. So I think the influence of Massachusetts is really significant compared to the influence of New Hampshire in terms of what it means for a labor shed.
Right.
And so that, I think, when we think about sort of repair task forces becomes really important. The influence of our infrastructure with regards to airports and sort of the different access to airports that we have down here versus up north is really significant. But what I do see around representation that I probably struggle with the most is that many of our government services are delivered through these contracted entities. And we've talked about that a lot here. It's one of my favorite topics, and I hope it's become one of your favorite topics. And those are all done by contract. And so each institution or organization does their work very differently. And so we see that with the community action agencies. Each region has its own community action agency. We see that with parent-child centers. Each parent-child center has its own. We see that with the designated agencies. We have HCRS here. They have something else up north, Howard Center. We see that with our development credit corporations too. We have BDCC, other areas of other things. So the way I see representation being the most challenged around things like that is that in the Montpelier bubble, when people are asked to testify on behalf of those organizations, it's almost always a representative from one of those agencies that happens to be in the Montpelier-Burlington nexus.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so the community action agency that represents that covers Montpelier tends to speak for all the community action agencies. The housing services organization from that area tends to speak for all the housing services agencies, when the needs might be quite different, because they're very different organizations with just different staffing structures and different grant configurations and different human needs.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that case, for me, representation really matters, because I don't see them telling the story of all of the agencies. I see them telling their story, and then there's an assumption that that story is universal to all of those agencies.
Mm-hmm.
On this task force specifically, I don't see that any of the people who are on the task force are being asked to speak for either a geography or even an industry. I didn't see representation in any of those ways. I was sort of curious how it was put together, because it didn't seem like there was even sort of like, there were certainly no workers on it, but there weren't really on the economic one. But there certainly wasn't even like a particular mix of like small business and corporation, or locally owned and nationally owned, or whatever, so those types of representation, I think, matter just as much or just as little as geography.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't a very clear answer I gave you.
Well, what your answer kind of clues up for me is two things. The first is just to talk about that notion of is south of Route 4 being forgotten about?
No, it's not.
But it sounds to me like people feel they are, in which it makes me wonder if we need to change conversations. Maybe there are needs that need to be met that just aren't being communicated. Or ways that communication is coming down from Montpelier that needs to be improved, so that people's perception of the issue might shift a little bit. But what it also reminds me is something when we were talking to Kelley about is, because this COVID has not impacted everyone in the same way, because everyone's situation going into the pandemic wasn't the same, the recovery is going to need to be very nuanced. And I think slow and long term. And by long term, I mean, as someone who covers municipalities, when recovery from Irene happened, there were some projects, infrastructure projects, that 5 years out, I was still writing about.
We still haven't finished recovery, our responsibility with recovery towards Tri-Park. They are still dealing in a very significant way with the impacts of Irene. Exactly.
And so if we use Irene as kind of our touchstone, and we're how many years, it happened in 2011, so we're how many years out? We have to expect, oh yeah, don't you remember? That was the year from hell in Brattleboro. We had the Brooks fire, we had the Entergy lawsuit, we had a number of killings, murders, and then we had our shootings, I should say, and we had Irene. Did I say the Brooks House fire?
You did.
Yeah, I couldn't remember. I lost count. So yeah, 2011 kind of stands out in my mind. But we have to expect that the recovery from COVID is even going to be more nuanced and more necessary. And so, I look at this task force and my first question is, and it's brand new and it's only a task force and things may evolve, but is it nuanced enough? And is the representation nuanced enough to start pulling at all these different threads that need to be pulled at?
I mean, I don't know if I even believe in task forces, even though I've sort of spent most of my career creating things like task forces and facilitating task force type meetings.
Well, then that's an interesting insight.
And so What happens though on a task force is that people have conversations there that form connections and start conversations that then each of those people bring back to whatever sphere of influence they have. Because the task force doesn't necessarily, rarely, sometimes, has some force of influence, but generally it's the people who are in it and what they bring back to their own spheres of influence, right?
Which I think we should say is probably how this task force is going to operate, because I remember reading in the press release that the governor very explicitly said this is not an advisory body.
And like, what are they doing? They are making everyone feel like we're doing something, is what they're doing, which is fine. Like that's also a good quality in a task force, is to help people feel like we're doing something. There are some people that are on the task force that I really respect, and who, Paul Costello for one, I think understands the needs of the state holistically, because he's spent deep time with the Council on Rural Development in each of our communities.
Yes.
And so where I think representation matters is that when we have someone who might, like, sure, they might live wherever they live in the state, but they need to actually understand the varied geography and the varied needs. So often the needs of Brattleboro line up best with the needs of Burlington, because we have sort of the two most scarce housing problems and the two most racially diverse communities in the state, right? And so sometimes I feel like Burlington could probably speak for us on those particular issues, right? But we need to be able to sort of like break things out that way to understand. We have a very powerful county delegation and a very capable county delegation down here in Windham County. And so in the legislature, I don't really worry about our needs getting forgotten at all. But there are sort of the individual nuances that should move a larger conversation. And so, you know, the tourism economy is one of them, certainly.
Yeah.
And I don't know if so that premise I set up, that one person who lives in one place could have sort of keep in mind the needs of all the rest of the state. I don't know if I entirely believe that, right? And so I can read a lot about the experience of someone, but until I engage in real personal relationships with that person, with someone sort of with that experience, I don't know if I truly understand that experience well enough to problem solve around it or elevate it. And I think that's similar to when we see representation in the legislature of just people who are upper middle class, right? Because their personal relationships really drive, or personal relationships is really what drives our stories of how the world is put together. And people tend to socialize with people who are similar to them, right?
You know, one thing that surprised me about this task force, going back to what you had said about, you know, Paul Costello and how he has worked in so many different communities, and how that has informed his knowledge of Vermont. I was surprised, unless I misread it, I was surprised that there wasn't more representation from the regional planning commissions, because part of what their job is to have a very broad understanding of their areas. And so maybe, you know, Chris Campany, who's the executive director of the Windham Regional Commission, may not fully understand like what impacts the Lake Champlain Basin. But if you get, you know, someone who deeply understands a lot of different aspects of how Windham County works, because they look at the economy, they look at the natural resources, they look at energy planning, and you get someone else who deeply understands how Chittenden County works, and you have them speaking, you can bring deep knowledge to the table. So I was surprised there weren't more regional planning folks.
Was there anyone from the RDCs either?
I thought I saw one person from the RDC, but that also surprised me. There was not many. And for folks who don't know, those are the regional economic development organizations, such as the Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation. Yeah, I don't know that I saw many of them either. I mean, maybe that might be the strength of this task force, is that it is the people you wouldn't normally think of.
Maybe. I mean, yeah. Well, we'll see. I have a lot of faith in Maura Collins. She's, I
Yes.
think, one
Is
of
she
the.
on there?
She is. She's on the
Good.
local support and community action team. There are those memes floating around, and I don't know if you've seen them, but it's like, which COVID house do you want to be stuck in, basically? And it's like various lists. Like there's like one of like different rock stars, and there's like one of different legislators that someone did on Twitter, and like there's a bunch of them. And I can't help like look at these 3 teams like that, 4 teams,
And think which
and be
COVID
like,
house you'd want to get stuck in.
yeah.
Which one would you want to get stuck in, since you have the list in front of you?
It's the local support and community action team. Is the one
Yeah,
I would
that's
want to get
probably
stuck
the
in.
one I'd want to get
Yeah.
stuck into.
What? The internet's very good these days, I have to say.
It is.
Mhm.
Change the Story had a few memes, some that were very gut-wrenching because of how they were highlighting some of our wage gaps in this state.
Yes.
But one of them and it was so simple, but it just shows how badly we all need to laugh, is social distancing Vermont style. You have to make sure you have at least 1 cow length between 2 people. It was just
So
what I
cute.
needed.
Yeah. The person who does all the communications for Change the Story is one of the leaders in the Central Vermont or Burlington recovery mutual aid stuff. So they are very busy right now and incredibly capable.
I bet they are.
Yeah. So that's actually a good thread on this sort of representation matters thing. So we know that the people who are being very impacted by this sort of essential person conversation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Tends to be single low-income moms, right? Like that's what
Yeah.
that's saying. It's the same trope about, I don't know if I should call it a trope, but it's the same tendency that is the folks most impacted by minimum wage, and the folks most impacted by any downturns in the economy, and the folks most impacted by everything. And in other states, those would be women of color.
Mm-hmm.
And so we would see those folks who would be most likely to also be dying of COVID. And so where is that voice in the recovery? The people who put their bodies on the front lines of this work to sustain us all, being in our houses, where are those people's voices as leading the recovery? That's my question. That's much more important to me than whether or not Southern Vermont has a talking head.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it brings back to me, how are we collecting those stories so that they can be heard by the people who need to hear them? And how are we connecting with those people? Because it brings us back to some of the conversations we had before COVID about how do we engage the community so as many voices are at the table as possible. And again, we have very good deliberative processes. But I mean, sorry, we have very good decisive processes, decision-making processes, but not deliberative, not collecting processes, let's say.
Yes. And I know that the Vermont Historical Society is doing sort of a StoryCorps kind of project around this time. But I'm perhaps unfairly sure that only a certain segment of society would engage in that. And again, the people who are on the front lines of this crisis are not the ones that have time to be documenting their challenges, right? And in some ways, there's been some really amazing union conversation standing up to represent those who are at the front lines, right? Like we see that in the nurses union doing a great job. Most of the co-ops in the state are unionized. And so while grocery store chains aren't, those co-ops are. And they are in some cases speaking on behalf of sort of all grocery store workers. But again, I'm just like really, left again in who is able to tell the story of folks who don't have the time and resources to tell it themselves. And well, I guess it's, it's kind of you, Olga. I mean, isn't that what journalists do?
We're part of it, yeah.
Yeah, especially if like journalism is like appropriately funded and staffed.
Funded and staffed. Yes, that's the appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you want to learn more about how journalism is funded and staffed, you can check some of the Pew Charitable Trust's research to see like what journalists earn compared to, say, PR marketing people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think we were around, in good markets, we're around 60 cents to $1, but I think some are more like 32 cents to $1.
Mm-hmm.
So that
And so
tells you where our community puts their priorities.
absolutely. And it's another place like, where low income folks are the ones at the front lines of this crisis, right? Like you're one of those folks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I lost the question. Oh, so here's just a mind game, because you know how I have these questions. We talk about workers' rights in Vermont, and Vermont is an at-will state. But it did make me wonder, given how much recovery we are going to have to do from COVID, what would it be like, and because Vermont's fairly small, if there was a workers' union that covers all Vermonters?
Yeah.
And that the requirement to be in the union is you either hold a job in Vermont or you are a Vermont resident. Like,
I don't know. That's so interesting. Like, I don't even know how that works. Like, I've wondered in the way that sort of organizing units works seems to be about like workplaces. And I don't know, legally and logistically, I'm really curious about what that would look like. So, like I've wondered what it would look like for you to join Digger's new union, right? Like, is that possible? Like, because we need something, because it is absurd for for employees of small businesses to organize as just their own standalone business. It doesn't work. So even, the designated agency or a lot of nonprofits are organized and they're technically under the union, the banner of the same union, but they don't organize together. And so what that means is they're sort of like fighting their employers around the scraps that the employers are getting from state government.
Right.
And what we really need is for workers to be banding together in a much more significant way. And we see the unions trying to do that. I mean, that's technically what the AFL-CIO is supposed to be doing, is like, uniting all of the unions under one banner. But so many people are left out of that because of the particular nature of employment in Vermont. And I do think that this is a really, as we are at least having, as middle-class people are at least having more and more conversations about valuing workers and worker time and worker safety, that this should be a moment of public sentiment that we could use to drive workers' rights in a much more significant way.
And, here's the thing about a union that covered everybody is its potential weakness is that you have someone from very different industries under the same umbrella. The needs of a tipped worker at a restaurant are different than, say, the needs of someone who's working in an industrial position.
But we even see that playing itself out in the Vermont State Employees Association all the time, right? Like the needs of a corrections worker and the needs of a social worker are completely different. And there's huge schisms within that union that are like constantly playing themselves out, and corrections mostly is winning. And I often see that union really being at odds with the needs of poor Vermonters, right? And so that's another like,
well, what I was about to say too is that weakness could also be a strength, because it would really force, I think, Vermont to have conversations that perhaps it hasn't had before.
Can I ask you a funny question?
Yes, you can.
So if all the workers came together to form a union, isn't that sort of like how all the states are coming together to form a union? But like, isn't that what like the federal government's supposed to be, is a union of all the states? So if all of the workers, like all Vermont workers, came together to form a union, isn't that what our state government's supposed to be?
I have played with the same question, which it would tell you something how state government perhaps is not not, at least as far as workers' rights are concerned. And who knows, state government, workers' rights may not be its responsibility. If, let's just say, there was this union and it was focused on protecting workers and making sure that all is well there, it could free up the state to focus more on things like education, infrastructure, healthcare. It could allow the state to have breathing room elsewhere.
Okay. Let's do it.
Okay.
Okay.
I can hear the screaming already.
Those are screams of joy and excitement.
Yes.
For the new future.
I think since COVID is hitting us in a big way, and we need to make sure that we are taking time to mourn what we are losing, I think this is also a time to think big.
Yeah.
Amongst that mourning, amongst the chaos, there's still a chance to dream big.
I've been there with you. And then I wonder if we sort of like think about the destruction and the creation impulse and archetypes, if my need to always see creation in the ashes of destruction is just me being entirely avoidant about actually sitting in the destruction.
Good question. I think it depends on people.
Me too.
I think that's an individual question you have to ask yourself. I know me as someone who tends to be very optimistic. I have been told that I don't know how the world works. And if I did, I wouldn't be an optimist. I'm actually defiantly an optimist. But again, I come back to, that's why we need so much representation. Because some people do want to sit in the ashes of destruction, and that's how their systems are wired. Where some people are more wired to just always look at the horizon. And that's how they're tuned. And so in a perfect world, we would have all those people
voices at the table, as well as the sustainers, right?
Yeah.
I'm realizing that the last few episodes, instead of ending up talking about cocktails at the end, we've been getting like a little spiritual. Not sure what it's about. So I'm going to do a quick pivot to cocktails before we.
Okay, please do.
Okay.
Yeah.
You sure? Okay. I think drinking is a really interesting thing right now. Because I think popular imagination is taking it in a lot of different directions.
Well, it has the capacity to go into many different directions too.
Yes. And so I know someone, when they isolated, they actually got all the alcohol out of their house, and really sort of understood what their path might look like. I know for me, with all of the days seeming the same, finding a transition between, late afternoon and evening, I need a lot of ritual attached to that. So I'm still changing my clothing at around that time, even though
that's smart.
It's not necessary.
No, it's smart. It's smart. Transitions are important when you're staying in the same space.
Yes. And so I've also really done, cocktail hour, and even a snack to go with cocktail hour has become very important. Different kinds of socializing at that time, different kinds of space. And so for me, it's a real way of alcohol has always been very ritual based for me, but it's a real way of marking the time between the work day and the transition to evening. And so I've been really enjoying mixing very fancy cocktails at my house, as a way of just continuing to spread out small moments of pleasure, which I think is really important right now, as well as marking time in a decisive way.
That's really interesting. I have not been drinking that much, and I have not been mixing cocktails, because I found, for me, one of the pleasures I get from cocktails, and I think one reason we made this part of the happy hour was I really enjoy going out with friends
Mm-hmm.
and talking to the bartender,
Mm-hmm.
and that experience of someone who has an expertise in something I don't,
Mm-hmm.
and what they can create, and then I get to try that.
Mm-hmm.
And then my friends were always so not COVID appropriate.
I think
We're always like, oh, here, have a sip of this, have a sip of that, have a sip of this.
Mm-hmm.
And that for me is part of the fun of cocktails. So drinking by myself in my apartment, I'm like,
yeah.
it's
And
not
I
as much fun.
feel as I drink, I mean, it's not entirely by myself because I have my family around, but also a lot of the time I do it sort of on an evening call, which sometimes it's a caucus meeting and sometimes it's social hour with friends. I have a regular Zoom with the legislators that I tended to socialize with, but not necessarily vote with. And so it's a way of sort of like connecting in this moment to all of that other time back then out there. And have sort of like a visceral experience, that thread that goes between the two things.
Interesting.
Anyway, yeah.
So you know what has happened? I have found, folks may not know this, but a few weeks ago, Emily was like, oh, you always show up with a different mug. And I do. I have a bunch of different mugs. They all have a memory attached to them. This is my birthday mug from my mother.
Oh,
Isn't that sweet?
Yesterday was Olga's birthday, everyone. Happy birthday.
Yeah. And I find that I choose my mug kind of like, okay, so what's my intention for the day? And what do I want to get out of today? What at the end of the day will make me feel successful if I've completed it? And then I tend to choose a mug to match that. So that's become one of my little morning rituals.
Oh, I love it.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
The things we do to stay sane.
Mm-hmm. Are we very over time?
We're probably very over time.
Okay.
And you have to go, but that's okay because I will edit for WVEW. I will edit a thing that fits within the hour. And then on YouTube or SoundCloud, they can hear the whole extended.
And they can just like enjoy us philosophizing together. So nice.
Or turn us off.
Whatever they want.
Yes.
A very good point. It was really nice to see you.
Same here.
I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Same here. And have a wonderful day being a lawmaker and all your other hats that you carry out into the world.
I'm going to the House floor today for the first time since this all happened. We've had
like the real House floor?
The virtual House floor. It's the first full convening of the full House since we voted in real life. It's the first virtual convening of the whole House floor. We've had small trainings on how to be in the full House floor, but we're about to try to do it for real for the first time. So I'm looking forward to that.
We need to talk about that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's going to involve a lot of people not knowing how to use their mute button, but I'll report back.
Well, you know the reporters will be listening into that.
It's going to be great. Okay. I'll see you soon. Thank you for a great conversation.
Same here, Emily. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.